Thank you, Andy, very much. Morning, everyone. As Andy said, we've been really looking forward to this series and trust that it will be of great help to us, not least because Faith Conversations is an essential part of who we are as a church. In fact, as Andy said, we've done a lot of thinking, reflecting recently, and we would say it's one of three critical priorities, if you like, for us as a church. So let me start just before we get to Faith Conversations to just mention what they are. Number one, we as a church exist for the benefit of those who are not yet part of us. And therefore, when we talk about this sometimes between ourselves, we are an engaged church, engaged with those who are not yet part of us. Secondly, we're a church that is convinced that we should be using our gifts and our abilities, our passions and our experiences to enable the world around us, the city, the community we're part of, to really flourish. And of course, we do that in all sorts of ways. This week, we have had the book launch of a member of Christchurch London, her first book, Jo Rossiter's first book, published by Penguin. And Jo is using the gifts and the abilities that she has got to write great stories and get them out into, if you like, the public world, and to use those to make the world a better place. But it's not just for the few who have unusual abilities like that. To give you another example, Andy mentioned this earlier too, on the city at the moment, there's quite a lot of talk about fostering and adopting. In other words, some of you are saying, maybe the best way I could invest my life is in the lives of individuals, little individuals who are vulnerable and need a home and need a family. That is just as much using our gifts, passions, experiences, and abilities to make the world around us a better place. And sometimes when we're talking amongst ourselves, we talk about that as an everything church. Psalm 24, verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Everything in it is the Lord's. It should all feel, every single slither of it, something of God's love, and the way that he does things on earth is through you and me. And the third thing that we're talking about as a church is we're saying we're a church who does all of these things, engages with our communities in every part of them, empowered by the Spirit. That we're a church who wants to do everything relying on the energy, the power, and the promptings that God gives us by the Holy Spirit. So we'll talk lots more about those. That's all familiar, I guess, to many of you who've been coming, though we've probably not put it in that sort of package. So sometimes, at least amongst ourselves, we've talked about the fact that we're a community, engaged in everything, empowered by the Spirit. And that's why Faith Conversations is so important. Because if you like, that's a deep dive into one particular area of this. And if you want to know more about being a church engaged with everything empowered by the Spirit, do come, as Andy said, to the Introduction to Christchurch London course. We'd love to have you there. Teaching, discussion, Q&A. You're most welcome to join us next Sunday. One other sort of pre-introduction comment or comments before we start to look at our subject. There's a change that has happened in Christchurch London over the last year or so. And that change is that we have increasing numbers of people attending regularly who are exploring questions of faith. Now, it may well be that if you would put yourself in that bracket, you would say, David, should I really come over the next few weeks, or should I take a pass on Christchurch London, given that your subject matter is how to have faith conversations with others? And we've worked really hard to make this a series that will help everyone. And here's three ways that it may help you if you're on a journey of faith at the moment. I guess we're all on a journey if you're particularly exploring. Number one, we hope that some of the talks will help answer some of the difficult questions that we all ask on that journey. And we'll be deliberately addressing some of those as we go through this series. Secondly, I hope that it will clarify for you what the next steps you need to take if you decide to do so on that journey. And that if you like, it will give you a clear action plan. And thirdly, it may be that you're far enough along this journey now to think, I have had enough good happen in my life as a result of this that I want to share it with others. And if that's the case, we're trusting that this series will equip you and enable you to start to have those conversations in natural and easy ways. So we hope that this will be a series for everyone. There is a challenge that lies behind this series. The challenge is not religion is old-fashioned and no one's interested in Christianity anymore. Actually, quite the opposite. 20 or 30 years ago, people said the 21st century might be the first century without major religions. All of that is now getting totally rewritten by the experts. They're actually saying faith could be the most important issue of the 21st century. And we know that from personal experiences. It's not unusual for people to email into the Christchurch London office. They say, we've never been to your church. We don't know anyone in your church, but please can we come on the Alpha course? We want to explore the big questions of life. So we know lots of people are interested, but nevertheless, there is a challenge that lies behind this course. The challenge is this: Christians have an image problem. And by using the word image, I'm not sort of trying to say, it's not really fair. Let me rephrase that. We have not done very well at presenting either ourselves or the claims of Christ over the previous couple of decades. Let's just unpack that a little bit. Let's just do a face the facts analysis before we get into the scriptures and are more into the subject today. Many people do not see Christians as trustworthy. Rather, we're perceived to have one item on our agenda, and that is to convert people using whatever methods are necessary to do so. So words, when you ask people, which a few of us have done quite a bit of recently, when you ask people what word comes to mind when they hear the word Christian, the sort of words that are often insensitive, rude, or pushy. Not only are we seen or perceived as having one item on our agenda, but we're also often seen as exclusive. We only want, so it's perceived, we only want those that agree with us to be part of us, and we're not open to considering new or alternative ideas or options. Thirdly, our critics will continue. We will get to better news, I promise you. Thirdly, our critics will continue. These Christians are responsible for some of the worst abuses that have happened. Sexism, homophobia, crusades, religious wars, and the like. And this leaves people asking whether Christians really are very nice people or not. In an age where tolerance is so highly valued, Christians seem to be the most intolerant people around. Challenge number one on are Christians trustworthy? But it doesn't stop there. Many people also regard us as being rather old-fashioned when it comes to talking about something like truth. The understanding of truth has changed in many ways in recent decades, the last century. Science has had a particular contribution to that. Once upon a time, the world was seen as black and white. Once upon a time, it was assumed that you or I could get to an objective standpoint where we could make a measured and accurate read on any situation. The answer to most questions was either yes or no. Now it seems things are different. Science is full of synthesis rather than right or wrong. Now, I'm on thin ice when it comes to science. I've never been a scientist. My results at 15 and 16 were not impressive when it comes to science. But my understanding is that if you were to ask, is light a wave or a particle, you'd probably get told both. In fact, I checked this out with someone a lot more knowledgeable than me with regards to science this week. I was sitting opposite them. I said, tell me, what is light, wave or particle? And they looked at me in a slightly disdainful way, and they just said, it's complicated. At which point, I rest my point. It is indeed not clear. Things are now a matter of probability rather than of certainty. Quantum theorists tell us the smallest level of reality is in differing places with differing levels of probability. And of course, there is no such thing, we are told, as objective reality. We all have our bias, we all have our vantage point, and you should simply admit it for what it is, one perspective amongst many. Now, all of that, which is genuinely, deeply, sincerely, not necessarily even militantly held by most thinking people now, undermines the way that we often talk about truth. Now, we may get to some of these questions. I'm not going to deal head on with these questions right now. I just want to sort of flag them up. Very happy for us to talk about them at another point. One individual who has been regularly attending Christchurch, London, who is exploring issues of faith, summed up what I've just said like this in an email. He said, one of my greatest objections against religion in general, and some aspects of Christianity in particular, is that how throughout history religion has been used to the wrong ends and how religions tend to monopolize the truth and is intolerant of dissent. The Grand Inquisition, the sale of indulgences, the 17th century wars of religion in Europe, and the Taliban, to name but a few. I knew we were in trouble when we got lumped in with the Taliban. Next slide. Also, Christianity today, if you read the press, seems to be more characterized by what it is against than what it is for. Christianity in the Western media seems to equate with one particular brand that is anti-science, anti-gay, anti-secular society, and anti-intellectual. I think this sort of thinking is dangerous and intellectually regressive. And of course, a lot of people will say, if I have to become like that to follow Jesus, maybe I'll take a pass. Now, here's the thing. I have a lot of sympathy with a lot of what that individual has to say. I don't like any brand that is anti-science, anti-gay, anti-secular society, or anti-intellectual either. And I suspect most of you feel the same way. But I want to say this to that individual and to thousands of others like them. You do not have to lump yourself in with that camp in order to become a follower of Jesus. So the question I want to ask today is not so much what's gone wrong as what can we do that is different. And guess who we're going to look at as an example? We thought it would be worth going back 2,000 years to Jesus. And I won't have time now to unpack all of the intellectual, political, religious environment that he was in. But to be honest, it's not that different from today. And he, the master storyteller, the master communicator, the master liver of life, shows us a wholly different way of having faith conversations, which I think you'll find is satisfying, exciting, and makes you stay human whilst you have them. So I've called this talk Digging Wells, Not Building Fences, and that will become clearer later on. Mark chapter 2 and verse 13 is the scripture we're going to think about a bit this morning. And it goes like this. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him and began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. And while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "What does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." What have we just read? Levi, known as Matthew in Matthew's Gospel, Levi has just decided to throw his lot in with Jesus. Essentially, he's saying, I'm going to make a big commitment. I'm leaving everything else behind. And he is clearly excited about this. This is a big deal if you make a life-changing decision. And clearly, if we make life-changing decisions, they're likely to be positive ones. If you make a positive decision, which is going to change your life, what do you want to do? You want to tell your friends about it. And so Levi thinks, I'm going to tell my friends. Maybe he thinks I haven't got time to tell them all one-to-one. Or maybe he just thinks that'd be a bit intense. So he says, I know what, I'll get them all over. And he says to Jesus, who's central to this life-changing decision that he's made, I'll get all my friends over. And Jesus says, I'll get all my friends as well. And they have a party. And what is interesting in this is we see immediately two dimensions to faith conversations. Individual. Jesus and Levi have spoken. And I don't think that this is the first time that Jesus and Levi have had a conversation. If Jesus just rocked up and looked at him and said, follow me, I think the answer is it's unlikely. I think they'd talked. I think they'd got to know each other. There was a basis on which Jesus could make that sort of ask. So we see a one-on-one dimension to this, and then we see a bigger crowd dimension. There's some things that happen and things that people experience when you put a crowd of people together that don't just in one-on-one conversations. We'll come back to that. But if you and I are to have faith conversations that genuinely serve people in terms of their spiritual needs, we will find that we need both elements of this in order for them to be effective. I don't like sermons that dwell on the negative rather than the positive, but just for a minute I want to reflect further on why so often we've been ineffective at talking about our faith. And I want to suggest it's often because we've become over-focused on one element of the whole process. We've become over-focused on one element of the whole process. And I think essentially that one element is, to sum it up, is to ask, is somebody in or out? Have they prayed the prayer? Behind that, of course, is something good. We will sometimes ask, is somebody going to heaven when they die? Interestingly, it's not a question that you ever hear past Jesus' lips in that way. It seems that Jesus was much more focused on helping people be fully alive than to live when they died, though there was a connection between the two. There's, of course, advantages of thinking very clearly in, out. And which side do you fall of the line? And that is that it's clear. And in this world of a marketplace of ideas and all the competing and changing things that are going on, certainty is helpful. But I think it has some disadvantages as well. If I was to draw, though, this focus, this over-focus, I think, on getting people to make a decision, I would draw it like this. It's very simple. If we take that dot as Jesus in the center of a circle, our big focus has been, are they in or out? Now, why is it that I think that an exclusive focus on this is unhelpful and that I don't think Jesus went there? Firstly, because you end up focusing on what somebody believes, their heads, rather than who somebody relates to, their hearts. Now, last time I looked, Christianity was all about a relationship, primarily. It's not that the head doesn't come into it, but it starts and it finishes with the heart. If we focus simply on in and out, then it ends up with statements and propositions and seeing how many of these that we can tick. Secondly, it makes us very goal-orientated in our approach. All you've got to do is get somebody over the line. This ends up with an insensitive approach that means that everyone gets nervous. Those wanting to start faith conversations, those on the receiving end, that they're going to try and make something happen to them. Thirdly, I don't think it makes disciples. And that is actually what Jesus is most focused on. Matthew 28, his last words to his disciples, go and make more of you. Go and make more disciples. You see, when we look at life like that, when you've crossed the line, often people think, now I have arrived. Question, how do you grow more? Now you grow more by knowing things. And so spiritual growth becomes how many sermons you've sat in and how many books that you've read. Are sermons good? Yes, I believe they are. Are books worth reading? Absolutely. Is there something more important? Yes. Doing what we hear. The Hebraic understanding of knowing is not actually have you got it filed away somewhere, it's are you actually putting feet to your knowledge? Are you living it out? So I would suggest that Jesus' approach to faith conversations was a little different. He was focused on building relationships firstly and foremostly. That certainly seems to be the point of the party. It was just a great opportunity to hang out and get to know people. You see, there's only one way to deal with the trust issue that we talked about earlier, and that's for people to get to know you and make a judgment on whether you're trustworthy or not. If you're going to convince people that you are not narrow-minded and belligerent, but thoughtful and gracious, then you have to let them get to know you. One of the articles that I read in preparation for this talk was written for people like you and I, most of us as Christians, and it was headed this: want to talk to non-Christians, 6 tips from an atheist. In it, the author spoke about a very good friend of his who is a Christian when she first expressed her desire to see him come to church. And here's what he wrote. He said, I know her faith is an important part of her life, and she knows I derive a sense of meaning from being an atheist. Because we have a trusting, here's the important bit, because we have a trusting, close relationship, we're able to discuss these differences honestly and openly. I mean, doesn't that help? Honestly and openly without getting defensive. Here's the important point I'm trying to make. You can impress from a distance, but you can only influence from up close. What are you doing with the way you're living right now? Are you trying to impress or are you trying to influence? To put it another way, just how closely are you prepared to live your life alongside others who aren't as far ahead as you are in terms of relating to God? Impress or influence? Jesus was committed to influence. Secondly, I think he was focused more on helping people develop a relationship with God than debating with them the rights and wrongs of various ideas. He did debate, but largely with those who were antagonistic towards him. With those who wanted to follow him, he didn't debate, he talked about and invited people into a relationship. Some of you will have heard this story before, but it bears repeating. A friend of mine, Grace, has been having faith conversations with one of her friends for about 4 years. But Grace says that for the whole of those 4 years, it's been at, if you like, an information level, a head level, debating this issue, debating that issue. And a little while ago, she decided to take a different tack and see if her friend would think about relating to God rather than talking about him. So Grace said to her friend, "Do you think God has ever spoken to you?" Her friend said that she thought she had to be in a religious building for God to speak. But Grace explained that that was not the case. In fact, she said, God speaks to us even before we're in relationship with him. How else would any of us find him otherwise in the first place? This woman then shared 3 times in her life when she had heard God speak. This was deeply moving, and both Grace and her friend found themselves in tears as they spoke about personal matters in a very powerful way. Here's what Grace said to me afterwards. She said, "I think that conversation was a total game changer for us. I don't think we'll ever go back to simply talking about God. The focus of our conversation now is much more likely to be how we can both grow in our relationship with God." Now, of course, it's a journey, and one that will almost certainly include decisive moments within it. But I think both Grace and her friend have found themselves on much more fulfilling ground right now. I'm not saying there's no place for talking about God. We'll be doing that during this series. I'm just saying that many of us have focused almost exclusively on that rather than helping people start to find a relationship with him. Incidentally, at the end of the conversation, Grace's friend said to her, "By the way, my fiancé is an atheist, and he has heard God speak to him recently. So he needs to find a priest to go and speak to." I thought this was a rather delightful sentence. Atheist and heard God speak aren't often found in the same sentence. Have you ever thought that your role in faith conversations should maybe be more like a guide? Someone helping others grow towards Christ and grow in faith than someone with all the answers who enters into the fray of debate. Jesus was more focused on a relationship with others and introducing people to a relationship with his Father. He also seemed not to be in a hurry. He understood the bigger the issues that we deal with in our lives, the more time we want in order to work them out. Jesus seemed to want to create a culture whereby men and women could hang around for a considerable amount of time and think through the implications of following him. It's why this party with Levi wasn't a one-off. It's why I think he started at a wedding turning water into wine. It's when he was accused. They said to him, his opponent said to him, "You spend too much time at parties. Follow your master's example." In this context, though, as Jesus did, essentially what he was saying is, come and be around me and have time to work it out. And when we start to approach faith and faith conversations like that, then we find that rather than just one big watershed, that there are lots of mini watersheds along the way. I love our baptism services at Christ Church. We've got one, as Andy said, coming up shortly. If you've not been baptized, maybe you want to think about that. One of the reasons I love them is the stories that we hear. Easter Sunday, I think 5 people baptized, 5 amazing stories of God's work in men and women's lives. So about a year ago, here was the story from one individual. She said, I've been coming to the church regularly for about a year. By regularly, she said, I mean about once a month. And she said, I used to sit at the back, and she said, I would weep through the worship. And she said, eventually I got to the point, she said, where I realized that God accepted me for who I am, not what I ought to be. And at that point, she said, I decided to give my life to him and to follow him for the rest of my life. Now, what would have happened? What would have happened if somebody 2 months into that process had said to her, now you've got to sort things out? The truth is, she was not ready. And so we need to be patient and give people time. My prayer is that we will have increasing large numbers of men and women who are just working it out, who are part of us. If I go up to the top of my house at 6 o'clock in the morning, I live in West London, I can see the planes lined up, waiting for the curfew to end at Heathrow and for them all to come in with their early morning load of passengers. And sometimes you can see 5, 6, 7 or 8 planes, but it's hard sometimes to work out which is first and which is last from that sort of distance. You know, finding faith and helping people find faith is just the same. Sometimes you can see God starting to work. He's drawing one, he's drawing another. You're just not quite sure who's coming to land first. Typically, it will take 5 or 6 invitations for people to say yes to coming to an Alpha course or a church event, not just one. Typically, it will take men or women 6 to 18 months of being part of this community before they get clear on how they want to live their life and whether they really want to follow God or not. That is okay. I want to suggest let's enjoy the ride. Jesus also seemed more concerned about helping people change the direction of the whole of their lives or the rest of their lives than when or how they crossed the line of faith. For example, when did Peter, the disciple, come to faith? Now, typically when I ask that question, I get at least 3 answers, 3 different answers from people. Some say, oh, it was right at the beginning. Some say it was in the middle. Some say it was towards the end of the Gospels. Now, my point for mentioning it is, it's not clear. It's not clear when he came to faith. Now, did he come to faith in such a way that changed the trajectory of the whole of the rest of his life? Yes. Tradition says that when he was crucified, he said, I won't do it the way my master did. That is too good for me. I will be crucified upside down. He had his life changed. But it's hard to work out when it happened. In other words, I think that Jesus very often was more concerned with the trajectory in which people were traveling rather than whether they were in or out. And if I was to draw that, I would draw it like this. In other words, the focus is not so much how close is somebody, but are they going in the right direction and are they responding to the things which they feel God is speaking to them about. Australian farmers have 2 options with regards to keeping their cattle together in their massive expanses of land that they have. And option number 1 is to build fences everywhere. The other is to dig wells. I want to suggest that we should be a well-digging church. Now, a few of you, and maybe the more theologically attuned, or you're skimming through the scriptures and you're saying, all right, David, fair point, but you're only giving 1/2. There were other times where clearly in Scripture people said, okay, and Jesus said, time to make a decision. Will you or won't you? Do you or don't you? Yes or no? And if you're sort of having that silent argument with me at this point in time, which I appreciate because it means you're really engaged with this, then I would say you've got a really good point. And actually, if we were to draw the whole thing accurately, maybe it would look like that. Is there a line? Yes. Is there a step which fundamentally alters everything? Yes. Is it the whole point? No. And so we need to learn to combine the two. Help people on a journey understanding that at some point they go in what the scripture talks about, they find life as a result. So, we've talked about the fact that this is an individual thing and a corporate thing. Let me just comment a bit on the communal side of things together, having focused a little bit on what Jesus did. And of course, the challenge for us is, are we building relationships? Are we being patient? Are we looking for opportunities to broach the big questions of life? How do we tie this together with our corporate life, whether it is our life groups, our connect groups, our Sunday services, or in any other way? Well, as I've said, our dream is that many people will be part of this community who are exploring faith. And this would certainly be a very biblical context. Jesus, most of the time, spoke to mixed crowds of disciples, tax collectors, sinners, and even his opponents as well, and worked out how to communicate to all of them at once. Master communicator indeed. But I think for us as a church, it means we've got to think about at least three things, which I'm going to go through very briefly as we tie things together. Number one, we have to think about what we say. Because I want to suggest that our language must be understandable not just for those who would regard ourselves as in, but for all of us. And this obviously includes our Sunday services, our websites, our blogs, and other, if you like, public settings. But if people who are not yet of faith are going to be part of our lives and churches, then our small groups and casual conversations need to be seasoned this way as well. We all need to learn to talk in such a way that doesn't put up unnecessary barriers to those who want to find God. When the early church hit one of those crucial points where they had to decide, will the gospel go to those beyond us, the Gentiles? Here's how James summed it up in Acts 15. He said, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. I want to suggest that is pertinent and powerful advice to you and me at this point in time. So we have to watch what we say, but then we also have to watch, maybe even more importantly, what we think. Sharing our faith is not about getting those who don't want to be got. It is not about catching those who don't want to be caught. Rather, it is about helping those who want to find God do just that. It's the most loving thing that people can do, because when people come to faith, they have the ability then to become the person God truly made them to be. So we need to learn to think that way and show that in our attitudes. I'm not suggesting here that a change of language and attitude are simply good marketing techniques for the 21st century. If it is simply that, then you and I will be exposed for what we fundamentally are, which is charlatans. It cannot be a gimmick. It must be sincere. Our hearts must be full of love. When our hearts are full of love, we'll be ready and find relatively naturally that our language will change as well. And thirdly, what do we do? Our goal here, still talking about the corporate environment, is to create a space where we can all grow together before God. Within that, we understand, as I've said, there are moments when we step across a line. A time when we know now that we are for God and that we're making a lifelong commitment. And when you've made that, it should be reflected in baptism. Baptism's the minute when you know. It may be, for many of us, we say, I know it happened then. But some of us might say, I don't know, but I know it's done. I know the work is, I can feel it in my heart. I'm different. Well, it's time to get baptized if that's the case. Let's have a wonderful celebration in June. And Michael Ramsden, as Andy said, is an amazing communicator. You'll love hearing him. And your family and friends, if you're getting baptized and you bring them along, will love him too. We want to give regular opportunities to do this, to help people step over that line, but we want to do it without ever singling people out or making them feel awkward. And we're on a journey as we work out exactly how that looks in each situation. Maybe the band could come back, please. In conclusion, we think every one of us should be involved in helping men and women in your world or in our worlds find faith. And we think that this can be one of the most fun and one of the most exciting things that we can possibly do. Next week, we'll talk more about it. Next week, it's Pentecost Sunday, so particularly we'll be talking about how the Holy Spirit helps us do this. And it can lead us to some very, very exciting moments indeed. But in closing for this morning, I want to ask you these questions. Who is there in your world who would allow you or has allowed you, invited you to draw closer to them? Do you allow them close enough so that they can work out that you are indeed trustworthy and loving? Are you then persisting with those people? Are you looking for opportunities, some of you, for the third, fourth, or fifth invitation rather than simply the first? And are you patiently walking them through their own journey of discovery alongside them? If we will learn from Jesus, I think we have some very, very exciting days ahead as we learn that faith conversations need not be awkward or embarrassing, but life-giving exchanges with our friends as we discover together what it means to follow God. Let's stand together, shall we?